Great, thanks, Neil. It was really interesting stuff from Julie. I thought there's going to be a lot of probably overlap between what Julie's been saying and what I'll be saying, but some differences too. So Neil sort of asked me to talk about what the main trends and directions in people management that I see happening kind of during and post-COVID. And I've picked kind of 6 areas, which I'll talk through a little bit of each of those. I won't go into huge amounts of depth, but hopefully I'll give you a flavour of some of the things that I think we're seeing. The first one really is organisational change and resilience. Very similar to Julie in a way. People have achieved so much. There's been so much change in such a small amount of time. Organisations have delivered new products, services, changed the way they deliver existing services. They've changed their ways of working. They've done huge amounts of change. It's been really, really impressive to see it happening. I went to a talk by the HR director of the Office for National Statistics, ONS, and she was talking about all the work they've done, fantastic work to help the country understand how the COVID virus is developing, to provide rigorous data under huge amounts of scrutiny. She was sort of saying that their work has never been so sexy, and sort of really, really has. They've designed and developed new data sources with the highest rigor under huge amounts of time pressure and done it brilliantly. And this is kind of probably an organization that probably would have said of itself, we're not that great at handling change, like lots of other organizations in this period of time. So the obvious question really is, how's all that happened? What can organizations learn that's enabled the changes that they've seen? I mean, previously you've got to compare it to the narrative on organizational change, which was largely that, most transformation efforts fail and that employees are generally resistant to change. So I guess the question is it possible we've kind of confused the capability and adaptability of people with the kind of ingrained habits of organizations? So in other words, have we labeled employees as resistant to change when in fact there is something in the habits of an organization that prevents people from effecting change? So I think in this period now, what we'll probably see is a lot of organizations reflecting on their experience of the pandemic and asking themselves and their employees what enabled this change to happen. Were there processes, systems and constraints that didn't support change previously that have been removed and we've realized we no longer need or actually get in the way? The second main area is really hybrid and remote working. So we all know there's been a seismic shift in working from home. Prior to the pandemic, only about 5% of the working population worked from home some of the time. And now it's like over a quarter of people work from home, exclusively work from home. And whilst there kind of appears a sort of daily divergence in opinion amongst leading business figures about the benefits of home working or some form of hybrid model, it does seem in the future that people want to work from home. More people want to work from home more frequently. So some of the stats around that, like 1 in 2 employees who've been working from home during the pandemic, so they want to continue to do so all of the time or often. And it seems that company directors in general, when surveyed, are also pretty supportive of more people working from home more frequently. But if we think about the research that was done prior to the pandemic, it showed kind of there were 3 main conditions really for working from home to really work. The first was that home workers had an appropriate space or environment to work in. The second was that they had appropriate technology. And the third, that they were effectively sort of trained and supported. So we think about the first condition, not everyone who's been working from home during the pandemic has had, excuse me, a suitable environment to work in. And that will continue if we get beyond the pandemic, that they probably won't have a suitable place to work in. So therefore, the kind of element of choice becomes really important. Employers giving people a choice about where they work, where they choose to work. And then in the second condition about having appropriate technology, that's the bit I think we've seen change. Most people have got the technology they need to work remotely. The third bit is probably the most critical and also the most complex, which is having people effectively trained and supported. So ensuring staff are adequately trained and supported in the remote world is especially important for people who are new to their career or they're new starters in a role. It's also important more generally that people are well trained to be able to use the technology, to be able to preserve and support their health and well-being whilst working remotely. but also for managers. I mean, it's really, really critical for managers to be able to manage remotely well and to build and maintain teams remotely. It's really, really critical. And some organizations have supported their managers really well in this, and others have kind of just, allowed them to kind of get on with it. In my previous research done at Rothbury Park, we found that the biggest barrier to actually remote working wasn't the availability of technology anyway. It was really cultural. So cultural in terms of whether actually it was accepted or not, also cultural in the sense of how and whether people felt included when they worked remotely. So whether the behaviours and the culture were consciously inclusive. So how do you build an inclusive culture in this kind of remote or partially remote world? Hybrid world is a really sort of critical challenge sort of going forward. The next main area I think is emerging is the employment deal or psychological contract. So during the pandemic, many of us would have kind of reconsidered a whole range of attitudes and expectations with regard to work. We'd be thinking about the place of work in our lives, how important it is, how much we want to work, how much we want to spend time with our families instead of working. But equally, employer expectations will be changing too. So we're in a recession, we're probably going to go into a long recovery. So, what sorts of careers will be on offer? What kind of pay progression will be on offer? Will there be a physical office space or not? And, what will that look like? So employer expectations are changing too. So we've long had the notion of the psychological contract, which is basically an individual's beliefs about what they give to their employer and what their employer should give to them. And it's a set of beliefs and expectations. So it's individually held and it's often not expressed. So the risk at the moment is that with employees potentially changing their views about what the employment relationship should look like, and employers may be doing the same, if they don't have that discussion, then that could lead to quite a lot of disengagement and disillusionment. So moving away from the individual conception of employment deal or psychological contract, on a more broader level, we're also sort of seeing broader trends in what employees may look for from work. So Gartner has done some research and has identified 3 things they think are changing in what people want from work. The first one is radical individualized flexibility. So in other words, much greater flexibility about where, when, and how much people work to suit individual needs and preferences. So no longer just simply core hours and a bit of flex around the edges, radical flexibility. A more human employment deal. So we've all gone through this period where we've been looking into each other's homes. We perhaps know more about individuals. Our managers know more about our lives. We know more about their lives. So the expectation actually, the employers will care about us as individuals and support us as such. I mean, that's always been quite a good management practice, but it's not always been evident. So there's a shift there. And the third thing is engagement with social and political issues. So Gartner argued that in future, employees will want to work for employers and not only talk a good game in terms of social and political movements, but also be very active in those. So things like Black Lives Matter and Me Too. So 3 broad trends in terms of what employers want. The argument goes that if employers don't live up to these expectations, then they won't be able to secure the talent that they need. Another area is kind of careers and workforce agility, which are not immediately obviously connected. But I think what's happened in the pandemic is that organizations have had to redeploy staff. They've had to understand how they can better utilize the skills of staff they have in order to enable the organization to respond rapidly to change. And I think that's focused organizations and made them realize that they don't always have a handle on how flexible their workforce actually is or can be. And central to understanding workforce flexibility or doing something about it is the notion of careers. So we often think of careers as sort of hierarchical progression through the ranks of an organization. But if you think about the idea of careers is that an organization understands in very broad terms the different types of work an organization needs to do and the skills and capabilities of the staff it has, and finding a way to match those 2 things through development opportunities, etc. So I think there's going to be, in previous recessions, we've seen the idea of careers fade. We've seen the idea of careers lost in kind of restructurings and delayerings. But I think this time we'll see a greater focus on careers, because I think people have made that connection between planning for careers and workforce agility that they'll need going forward. Another issue is health and well-being. So health and well-being has been part of the narrative around work for some time. I think prior to the pandemic, the focus had been on health and well-being almost as employee benefit, you know, lots of talk of fruit bowls and lunchtime Pilates and such like. I mean, I like Pilates, but I think that's been the main focus. There's been less of a focus on the nature of the work itself and how do we create work which is provides support, provides control, and all of those social and psychological dimensions of work. And I think during the pandemic, we've seen that change. We've seen a greater appreciation of the health benefits of people having autonomy over work and having effective social support. The other aspect of, I think, health and well-being is changing is a growing recognition of health and well-being as a business asset rather than purely a business continuity risk. So we're now seeing investors make decisions about whether to invest in companies or not based on how well they treat their staff. So we've seen this morning news about a couple of big investors not wanting to invest in Deliveroo. Now, partly that's because they think that employment regulations might change and that might increase the cost of labour to them, but it's also to do with feeling that that organisation may not be seen in many people's eyes as a great place to work. So I think we'll see employers making greater efforts to in sort of enhance their health and wellbeing efforts and think about the health and wellbeing, the health of the workforce and as an asset. And the final area is kind of line management capability, because I mean, effective line management capability really is central to all of the things I've talked about. And it's fair to say that line management capabilities have been probably patchy and has largely reflected a tendency to promote people to positions of people management based on technical capability rather than people management skills. I think as we move into kind of a remote world or a hybrid world, that's not really no longer tenable really. We need people who can manage individuals well, and we need people who can build and maintain effective teams. And we've seen the importance of line management capability in some of our own research during the pandemic. We did a survey at the very start of the first lockdown, which showed that staff who had more frequent conversations with their line manager retained a greater sense of organisational commitment and improved health during that first phase of lockdown. So those are my kind of areas of directions of people management trends and changes. So it's not everything, but I think it's hopefully something useful.